panel, which is outside of the living room, or television outside the living room, memory, nostalgia, and museums, is going to be done with the three presenters today. Because there's only three, I'm going to give them a couple extra minutes for their presentation, so I won't be as militant with their signs. But I do want to leave some time at the end of the presentation so that you guys can ask questions and whatnot. And we have Mabel Rosenheck. Sorry, I apologize. Mabel Rosenheck, Kate Newbold, and Dale Moeller, and two from Northwestern University and from Central Michigan. So we're going to go in the same order that's in the presentation catalog, as it were, and feel free.
On June 28, 1955, Congress authorized the appropriation of $36 million with which the Smithsonian Institution and its National Museum would construct a new building on the Mall in Washington. Despite the addition of the Arts and Industries Building in 1881 and the Natural History Building in 1910, the National Museum's collections inevitably continued to grow, and by the 1950s demanded new space for storage, conservation, and exhibition. Proposing the creation of a new Museum of History and Technology, Secretary of the Smithsonian, Dr. Leonard Carmichael, explained to the House Committee on Public Works, the museum we envision from its foyer, where we propose to enshrine the original Star Spangled Banner, through the whole sweep of its exhibit halls, is planned to instill in each citizen a deepened faith in our country's destiny as champion of individual dignity and enterprise. Equally, it is conceived to instill in each foreign visitor admiration and respect for our ever-expanding social and technological horizons. With the emerging ideological context of the Cold War, the Museum of History and Technology was planned as a celebratory affirmation of Americanness through a national narrative of industrial evolution and technological progress. And with the financial prosperity of the post-war era, the museum itself was born. When it actually opened in 1964, the stated purpose of the museum was, quote, to present the history of science and engineering and of the cultural development of the United States since the discovery of America. Today, the museum, now known as the National Museum of American History, changed its name in 1980, dedicates its collections and scholarship to inspiring a broader understanding of our nation and its many peoples. Though founded with a focus on science, industry, and engineering, as seen through artifacts like Eli Whitney's cotton gin and Charles Lindbergh's plane, The Spirit of St. Louis, the museum has since come to describe and construct itself as a site in which the nation is represented not just through science and a teleology of native innovation, but also through the everyday artifacts and mass cultural texts of the recent past, as they too shape and reflect who Americans are as individuals, as communities, and as a nation. Of the current scholarship on the Museum of History and Technology, most focuses on the intellectual and artifactual origins of the museum, where key objects and collections are used to illuminate technological progress, national prowess, and American civic pride through the history of the Industrial Revolution and the coincident rise of the modern American nation-state. In writing the more recent exhibits and trends at the museum, the transition to an emphasis on social and cultural history is often noted in passing, but is little examined in terms of its historiographic and epistemological consequences. While this is part of a broader project on the history of television and popular media at the National Museum of American History, this paper focuses specifically on one example, the All in the Family artifacts and their display, examining what's at stake in and what is made possible by the representation of recent pasts, cultural artifacts, and media environments in a national institution like the Smithsonian. Ultimately, what I want to argue is that new possibilities for citizenship and civic engagement emerge through the simultaneous social, cultural, and technological spaces of the museum as it explores the relationships between television, historical knowledge, and American identity or national belonging. Though the museum did have a nominal investment in cultural history, as identified in the original mission quoted above, in the 1960s and 1970s, that dimension seems largely to have been overwhelmed by the history of science, the state of technology, and the celebration of industry. However, exceptions from this era, like the Hall of Everyday Life, with its in situ approach, to quotidian Americana, provide an important starting point for thinking about how television ultimately becomes part of the museal landscape and the Smithsonian's construction of the nation. While providing historical context to otherwise banal objects, much like television itself, the domestic period rooms which characterize the Hall of Everyday Life also negotiate negotiate gendered spaces as they bring the private, feminine sphere of the home into the public, masculine sphere of the nation and the museum. Stephen Lubar and Kathleen Kendrick have suggested that the very idea of representing the home in these rooms may also be a way of projecting a set of 1950s Cold War consensus values onto the past, such that it appears natural, continuous, and American. While sympathetic to this point, what I want to emphasize is that media like radio and television, but also the museum itself, are already undermining the separately sphered nuclear family by restaging private forms of domestic female citizenship in the public arena, where more masculine and traditionally political civic life is represented and performed. While later exhibits from the 90s and 2000s more fully realized the parallel between the museum's negotiation of gendered space and the process by which broadcast technology allowed the public male sphere to enter the private female home, there is nonetheless an important suggestion of these dynamics already in the hall of everyday life. Bridging the gap between these in situ period room displays and later ones that explicitly thematize television in the home is the emergence of television artifacts as collected items at the museum, a practice that began with the 1978 donation of Edith and Archie Bunker's chairs from the set of All in the Family. The museum's first major television acquisition, the chairs were initially displayed from 1978 to 1991 as part of the bicentennial exhibition A Nation of Nations. The exhibit included a section called Shared Experiences, which featured areas about entertainment and a series of 20th century period rooms, all of which made it a logical site for the chairs display. In addition to the chairs, the museum also acquired the side table that sat between the chairs, a doily, an ashtray, and 2 prop beer cans. To this, they added a flea market throw rug and patterned wallpaper so the exhibit would suggest the bunker living room. The original display also featured set drawings and photographs from the show, along with a label that read in part, "The All in the Family TV series, which began in 1971, has consistently presented issues foremost in American consciousness. Intolerance in its many forms, frequently ethnic prejudice, was one of the basic themes. Archie Bunker, that arch bigot, became identified with all that flawed the relationships of our multi-ethnic citizens. The interplay between Archie's bigotry, Mike's civics, Polish-American liberalism, and Edith and Gloria's search for tolerance and acceptance reflected that nation's social struggles, holding a dramatic mirror to America's conscience." In his book, Rerun Nation, media scholar Derek Compare argues that, quote, "most of these historically legitimated materials have related to the creative rather than either the industrial or reception aspects of television." He goes on to specify that, quote, "the collection of props and sets from a particular television series at the Smithsonian bolsters his construction of the heritage, locating its power in the familiar, mythical artifacts of television itself, rather than the more complex practices that brought these objects to the air to begin with," end quote. While perhaps true, in this label there's certainly no discussion of the policy contexts or network practices that foster the show's creation, Compare's analysis is nonetheless limited by not considering the ways in which these artifacts operate as part of the museum as a dynamic and performative environment. I would argue that there are numerous ways in which television and the All in the Family display are activated as technologies of history and memory, rather than as static or simplified icons. Indeed, the visual and spatial arrangement into which the display entered, the museum's adjacent 20th century period rooms and rotating exhibits on entertainment, point to various possible narratives and spatial or factual connections which can suggest television's simultaneously social, cultural, and technological histories and modes of reception. Compare's point is in fact only accurate if we view displays like that of Edith and Archie's chairs as isolated and self-contained cases that are disconnected from the rest of the museum, as well as being disconnected from the on-screen TV text and the experience of watching television. For instance, within the display, the relationship between the objects themselves, within the display and within the relationship between the objects themselves, it is significant that, at least at first, the artifacts were not simply arranged as things tangentially related to one another, but were arranged to suggest a space, the All in the Family set, which itself is a living room laid out around the television. In addition to evoking the intertwined history of the post-war nuclear family and the domestic sitcoms set in the home and viewed in the home, this earlier spatial configuration in the museum can work as a reminder that television has often operated as a window on the world, a technology of audiovisual transportation that promises viewers a glimpse of foreign environments. However, in a kind of reversal, in the All in the Family display, it is the public technology of the museum that provides the window on the world, a world which here is the domestic space of the living room. In this context, television's window on the world is not so much one that opens onto exotic locales, opens from a nation composed of diverse and even exotic peoples onto the familiar everyday spaces of American living rooms. Instead of the public being brought into the private space of the home in the form of both the bunker's living room and the living room in which the viewer or visitor would have watched All in the Family, is brought into the public space of the museum. This does, in part, reaffirm Compare's point about television familiarity. The negotiation of public and private in the museum also parallels, or in some sense reverses, the work which All in the Family itself did for television and for the home. Describing the 1960s TV landscape into which All in the Family entered, Richard Adler suggests that a seemingly unbridgeable chasm yawned between the bloodshed and strife reported on the 6 o'clock news and the escapist fare that followed. Though not necessarily true of all 1960s television, Adler's point is well taken, especially with regard to the realist domestic family sitcom. Adler continues, prior to the All in the Family, social problems were portrayed as something that happened out there in the public arena. By contrast, home was a refuge and the family was sacrosanct, this realm of the purely domestic. All in the Family creator Norman Lear ignored these conventions and portrayed the family as a political arena, as the political arena. Though writing mostly about All in the Family as programming content, which is a representation of political debate within the home, Adler and Lear are also both evoking television as a domestic technology, which allows, or perhaps forces, the public political sphere into the supposedly apolitical home. Likewise, though again in a sort of reversal, the presence of television on the family in the museum allows or forces the politicization of its representation of the home and the family, a representation which, like television's families, can be linked to origins in Cold War nationalism and 1950s containment. In this link, we can see a point that Compare makes in the chapter cited above. Compare suggests that it was in the 1970s when personal memories of television and the 1950s nuclear family became a part of public discourses of nostalgia for not only a mythic domestic space and a mythic family, but for a mythic nation where consensus and prosperity reigned. Yet while the Cold War-inspired room and the bunker's 1940s-style chairs may suggest a more conservative longing for an illusory past, those were the days indeed, All in the Family, the TV show, may suggest a textual rupture of that nostalgia. Not only does the family circle here suggest the mythic 1950s family, it also suggests a complication of that family by the social change of the 1960s to 1970s. As Horace Newcomb argues of All in the Family, patterned after the domestic comedy, it challenges every stereotype of the formula. The innovations of All in the Family may be seen again as directly related to the family patterns established in more conventional forms of comedy. Bunkers are not Ozzie and Harriet. Though like traditional sitcom casts, All in the Family revolves around mom and dad and their 2 kids. Here the kids are grown and have developed their own opinions, which often loudly oppose not only those of mom and dad, but those of a whole generation of television ideologies, a whole generation of Cold War and American television ideals. As Adler writes, All in the Family succeeded in symbolizing and dramatizing the conflicts which had arisen throughout the country during the 1960s. The division within this one family, conservative versus liberal, patriot versus skeptic, old versus young, mirrored in comic form the polarizations which threatened to divide the country as a whole. Thus, not only did the bunkers disrupt the image of the television family, that disruption is part of broader social conflicts which challenge the mythic American nation, the nation the museum itself was designed to champion. In this way, the All in the Family display can productively disrupt the domestic ideals at work or work around it in the 50s-inspired 20th century period rooms, but can also disrupt the gallery of pop culture characterized by nostalgic displays of figures like Howdy Doody and displays of nostalgia like Fonzie's leather jacket. So this last point speaks to the changing configurations of the chairs. So in the top left, you see I think it's not actually quite the original, but it's more or less the original display. Then later, they displayed just Archie's chair as a single artifact. In this, what they developed this National Treasures of Pop Culture display, which is where the ruby slippers are usually displayed, and Kermit and all those kinds of things. And then, so for a while, they just displayed the single chair, and I think that's very much this sort of disconnected item that just says All in the Family-ness in some way. And then this is the current, more or less the current configuration in the bottom left, which has Edith's chair back, and then the side table as well, but still, but it's not, they don't have the rug and the wallpaper, so it's a little less living room-like, and again, it's not within context of this display on Nation of Nations, it's just this display case next to the ruby slippers, Kermit the Frog, etc. So I have positioned All in the Family in relation to period rooms and domestic in situ display, suggesting that the living room, that of the bunkers, those of the adjacent displays at the Smithsonian, and the living room of the visitor, are pivotal contexts in which to read the significance of both All in the Family and television at the museum. Drawing on Tony Bennett's vision of the museum as a civic laboratory in which, quote, reconfigurations of the relations between objects and persons come to be connected to and play a role in the reconfiguration of social relations. In the museum, television is a subject which connects and reconfigures or reflects the reconfiguration of the social relations of the private and the public, history and historiography, and the citizen and the nation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the conference just for inviting me, and thank everyone for coming. It's been a great experience here. Lots of really good panels and interesting stuff. So I hope I can add to that a little bit. My paper's on Discourses about television, which is a bit different than what a lot of these panels have been talking about. I think it's interesting that the conference's title is What is Television? Because this is not a new question. This is a question that has been going on since television was invented and since television was marketed to people in the early history of TV. And I'd like to just kind of take us back a little ways to this first decade after World War II when television kind of rose to ascendancy in many cultures, and not only in America, but in Great Britain too. I spent a year in Glasgow, Scotland, researching kind of the British experience of TV, and I'm working on a comparative study between the two. So I'd like to just give you guys a little bit of a sample of some of the things I found, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. First, some historiography stuff. There's been a traditional historical focus on programming in television studies. Historians have looked at, how presidential debates have been covered by television, how royal ceremonies in Britain have been covered by television. You've got histories of genres like news and sports and drama and comedy. In essence, what you have is a history of what was on television, but not a history of television itself. Now that has some important consequences, right? Because programming, especially in this early period, was controlled by a very select group of people. Mostly white, middle to upper class men who were pushing their own agendas, right? They were, this is a very kind of closed off group of people. That also makes it difficult to find some kind of consumer perspective here because consumers didn't have a whole lot of say in what they were watching on TV. And so part of my goal is to find this consumer perspective, figure out what consumers, what new television owners or potential television owners might want from a TV. So how do you do that? Where do you look? Well, Discourses is one way to attack this problem, how to find this consumer perspective. The media, newspapers, magazines, journals, radio, covered the spread of television and the rise of television. And that made it accessible to everyone. So as people are witnessing TV kind of explode in the late 40s and early 50s, they're reading about it. They're seeing every day in newspapers where it's expanding, how the technology has developed, things like that. At the same time, consumers are contributing to this discourse by writing letters to the editors of these magazines. You get these really unique kind of additions to the discourse from consumers themselves. Advertisements offer a really unique look at these things. Now, advertisements come from television manufacturers themselves, but as Lynn Spiegel points out in Make Room for TV, advertisements represent a bit of a negotiation between manufacturers and consumers because manufacturers have to appeal to consumer hopes and fears. Right? So if consumers are worried that TV is going to take over their home, advertisements might push them to think that it won't take over their home. Right? Or they might, if consumers think, oh, TV might help bring our family closer together. Well, that'll be something that advertisements will definitely emphasize, right? So advertisements offer a very unique look into this consumer perspective. Set design, too, is also an interesting way to figure this out. As sets change over time, as the actual television technology changes, historians have noted that it gets a little bit less alien, right? You try to put it in some kind of attractive box, have doors that can shut on this alien technology. We're looking for discourses, trying to figure out how to find a consumer, manufacturer, non-broadcaster, non-programming outlook. Now, as I mentioned, the search for this consumer perspective is not a new one. Lynn Spiegel was doing her work 20 years ago. But what I'd like to add to it a little bit is this idea of transnational or comparative discourses, which I hope to show were there from the very beginning, right after World War II, and maybe even beforehand. People thought of TV in transnational and comparative ways, and hopefully I can try to prove a little bit of that. First, a note on chronology. Some historians have been reluctant to look at television from 1945 to 1955, simply because not a lot of sets were sold during that time. You know, by 1960, saturation levels had reached very high levels, right? Almost everyone owned a TV in the United States and in Great Britain, actually. There's also a regional component to this. The Northeast, New York, Boston, in Britain, London, the southeast of England. Television was very popular there, but once you got out of those main areas where transmission was not necessarily possible, not a whole lot of people had TVs, and if they did, it didn't do them a whole lot of good anyway. So there's this regional component to this as well. I've got some just Gallup numbers here. For example, 1945, only 19% of Americans had even seen a TV in operation. But we shouldn't just discount this period because of that, right? Because awareness was high even in the 1940s. That same poll, 1945, 85% of Americans knew what a television was, even if only 19% had seen one. And then by 1949, 44% of Americans had seen a TV program, 62% by 1950. So awareness is high. People are reading about these things in newspapers and magazines. Television has become a popular topic, even if you're not a consumer of television yet. It's a lot like the internet in the 1990s. If you didn't have the internet, you certainly knew what it was, right? We also shouldn't discount the importance of communal viewing patterns. Just because you didn't own a TV didn't mean you didn't watch TVs. And especially in this early period, people gathered together for television parties and watched important events on TV at their friend's house. That same poll from 1949 that showed almost half Americans had seen a TV program, only 4% of those people had seen it in their own homes, right? So they had been watching it somewhere else, on somebody else's TV. Sometimes this was done in public spaces. Historian Anna McCarthy has talked a lot about how television in the public space really offered some kind of communal experience for watching TV. And then in Great Britain, just as an example, the coronation broadcast in 1953 was watched by almost the entire population, even though a very small number of people owned televisions. People were watching it in pubs, they were watching it in cinemas and theaters, and they were watching it at friends' houses. I think the average number of people around the set for the coronation was like 12. So this is just another indication that we shouldn't just discount this early period because ownership levels were so low. We need to really dig into what people thought about TV at this time. So where does the transnational stuff come in? Well, prior to World War II, the United States and Great Britain had led the way in the development of TV culture. There's been a lot of debates about who invented TV and where the technology came from. I know when I lived in Glasgow, they were very proud of John Baird. You guys people around here who John Baird is? They might not know. They might say that someone else invented TV, right? So this goes back to before the war. Of course, World War II interrupted television service and television development. So, anyway. After the war ended, both these countries sought to go back to this pre-war race that they had going on about who was going to develop the best TV. Both countries' television industries wanted to kind of establish themselves as the superior industry. In comes the consumer. They're exposed to these debates right from the beginning. And as I said before, they actually engaged in the discourses. And that made the discussions and debates over the new medium transnational and comparative from the very beginning. People were always looking at television culture as a whole, America and Great Britain as one whole television culture. And they were also comparing each other from the very start. What's America doing? What's Britain doing? We're better than them, they're better than us, right? These comparative discourses are important from the very start. We also shouldn't discount the importance of the Cold War in this discussion. After World War II, the global environment, I'm sure we're all aware, the global environment had been completely rearranged, U.S. is now one of the dominant superpowers in the world. Great Britain had finally fallen from its imperial standing down to a country that was struggling to find its place in a reshaped global environment. And then finally, just this early period is especially important because of the BBC monopoly. That's a very different experience than Americans had, right? The BBC did not do sponsored programming at first, and their tight control over television in Britain makes a comparative study really interesting, right? Because consumers in America and consumers in Britain had a very different experience about what TV was. We can look at what effect did the BBC have, and I'll get to it in a second, these kind of debates over sponsored programming when independent television starts gaining steam in Britain. So I just want to give you guys a couple examples of some of the evidence I found to show this kind of comparative outlook of consumers during this period. And remember, these are all articles from very widely read newspapers and magazines, and they all tend to push some kind of comparative outlook on things, right? So here, this is right after World War II ended. We're talking about getting television rolling again in Great Britain. C.O. Stanley, chairman of some committee, he's arguing that we need to get television up and running right now. Why? Because, quote, America would have television sets on the market produced in mass quantity early in the new year. And if the British industry did not move at once, it would be another instance of too little, too late. Britain didn't want to give up its lead that it had prior to World War II, and it's important to get back on track right now. Another aspect of this is kind of this Cold War in the economy and how important TV would be to getting the U.S., to cementing the U.S. as a global superpower. A lot of this discourse ties TV to U.S. military might, right? So David Sarnoff is talking about television zooming like a V-2 rocket. Or this Wisconsin senator who proposed a push-button emergency government to function by television in case of some atomic blast that blows up the whole government, right? We'll be able to communicate with each other across very, very large areas. There's a lot of coverage of television being used in A-bomb tests, or television underwater so they can see Bikini Atoll get blown up from beneath the surface of the waves. Again, just kind of tying this to Cold War ideology down at the bottom there. The public must be kept fully informed if we are to achieve the still remote blueprints of a democratic peace and equal opportunities for the pursuit of happiness. Television would be a perfect tool for this, right? You can disseminate information very quickly. It'll be in service of democracy, which is always a good thing for Americans. On the British side, the Brits were trying to figure out a way to exert some kind of cultural influence without imperial might that they once had. So television becomes a way to spread British kind of soft power in new ways, right? I love this quote. They may have the dollars, they may have communism, but we want television, right? Television is going to be our gateway. And so you can see a couple of the important events that were broadcast over the BBC. Very cultural imperialism. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just skip through this. To the comparisons of British and American TV. We've got Brits traveling to America, Americans traveling to Britain, coming back and kind of talking about what television was like in that other country. So this guy, he's talking about, his general conclusion is that at the present time, America could not show pictures equal in merit to those we had in 1939. Her program material could not compare with what we possessed, and in that respect, he paid a special tribute to the work done by the BBC. Interestingly, he says that television had not yet made an impression on the national life in America, and he failed to find it in the home. I don't know which homes he was looking at. Similarly, when the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II was broadcast in the United States, New York Times reporters commented on how great the coverage was, right? Jack Gould calls it the birth of international television, and as smooth as anything that American video broadcasters had done. He wrote that in watching the scenes from the interior of the Abbey, a viewer had a sense not only of being there, but a feeling as if England through the ages was coming into one's own home. And Americans seemed to realize that Britain was using television as kind of a replacement for its old imperial power. This guy wrote, thank you, the United Kingdom alone is not important strategically, but as the center and heartland of a great association of nationalities, it is. The ceremony of coronation, anachronistic as it may seem, harking back to the symbols of an age that is dead and gone, is an important factor in holding the heterogeneous British family of nations together. Again, kind of tying together that old empire through a new technology. And Americans are very aware of this, right? They're seeing this happen from across the ocean. Skip. The great Reith quote about sponsored, this debate over sponsored programming, Americans had it, Britain didn't at the beginning, but there was independent televisions trying to introduce sponsored programming. John Reith, director of the BBC, compares sponsored programming, and this is a very famous quote, to smallpox, bubonic plague, and the Black Death. I think after some of the panels we've seen today and yesterday, we might agree with that. A nice letter from T.S. Eliot, who's arguing that television is bad no matter what. It doesn't matter whether or not the BBC is kind of governing what's going on TV or not. The television habit, and again, he's talking to Americans about this, and he's traveled to America. He has American friends who say that television's destroying the minds of our children, and Eliot's saying that whether or not the BBC has any control over it, television is bad in general. It doesn't matter what's going on TV. I'm just going to skip to the end. So what conclusions can we draw? Well, discourses help us get some kind of manufacturer and consumer perspective, as I said before. And this also kind of gives us crucial insight into a very important era when television was still developing. We don't want to just start at 1955 when television's kind of already taken off. How were people introduced to television? How did they first find out about TV? How did they conceive of it, discuss it, and debate it, even before they even owned a TV, right? It was transnational and comparative from the very beginning. These discourses were looking across the ocean, we're comparing with each other, we're talking about the rise of a kind of, already the rise of a transatlantic television culture. And again, television played a very important role in a reshaped global environment that was increasingly influenced by the Cold War. Television became a tool for cultural imperialism. It also became a tool for disseminating Cold War culture in the United States. I'd just like to leave you guys with kind of a call for more work on this. There's a lot to be done with discourses and more work outside of the programming field. So that's it.
Among this panel, I've seen a lot of really interesting connections that I hope we can get into in the Q&A. My presentation today, Exhibiting Nostalgia, Personality, Authenticity, and Living History in Local Museums of Television. It's actually more a local museum due to time constraints, but this is some work that I'm starting on chapter 4 of my dissertation, so I would love any and all feedback that you guys have, so thank you in advance. Since he was a young man collecting early TV sets in the 1960s, Larry Allman always knew he wanted to open a television museum. Growing up in Dover, Ohio, a small town in the Tuscarawas County region an hour south of Cleveland, Allman cultivated his fascination for television by watching as many programs on his family's 7-inch Motorola as he could. He also began amassing all sorts of television-related materials alongside his TV sets. Board games, comic books, record albums, advertisements, toys, amateur technical guides, TV lamps, magazines, TV scarves, photos, cookbooks, even greeting cards. Over decades, Allman had stockpiled a massive collection of early television memorabilia, including over 300 sets and virtually thousands of artifacts, historically situating these receivers within their respective moments of distribution and display. In 2001, he located a suitable space for rent in the business district of Dover. 3 years later, the Allman Museum of Radio and Television opened to the public. Mr. Allman currently offers personal tours by appointment only, during which he narrates the commercial, cultural, and personal histories of the TV sets and memorabilia he's collected since the 1950s. According to the RoadsideAmerica.com field review of Allman's museum, the experience Allman offers is somewhat surreal and definitively disjunctive for the average it, quote, "The front of the building is muted, and you enter a small waiting area thinking, is this all there is?" Then Larry theatrically pulls aside the curtain to reveal the rest of the museum. Windowless, womb-like, as isolated as the inside of a time capsule, end quote. These time capsule and womb metaphors evoke quite striking images and mark out somewhat competing temporal dimensions to this museum experience. The museum as womb conveys a hermetically sealed, hollow space from which futures emerge, a forward orientation that conceives and shapes prospective moments. By contrast, the time capsule, a fairly common metaphor in popular literature on museums and collecting, references what Vito Acconci calls a historical place, one strongly linked with memory and preserved time. In his conception, historical places imply that, quote, "there's no space without time. A place has no life until time has gone by," end quote. In one or the other metaphorical case, time has either passed or not yet come to pass. Such spaces, and the experiences we have in them, are in a sense out of time proper. Yet I argue that neither of these is truly representative of the experience Ahmed wants to create, and not the experience he has created for many visitors over the past 8 years. Rather, his museum acts as a locus for the active, recollective, and interpretive connections patrons make when they encounter television through his dynamic presentation and display system. In this paper, I will explore the Ahmed Museum of Radio and Television as a site fostering present engagements with obsolete materials, a condition which suggests both the past from which they came and the future which renders them obsolete. Visitors are invited to experience a living history of television, predicated upon tapping into and crafting televisual nostalgia for former times. This museum, and others like it, illustrates how individuals and institutions alike sculpt nostalgia to reflect their views on today's media environment. My argument also demonstrates the importance of studying nostalgia beyond programming practices, and engaging supporting industries like nonprofit museums and tourism that offer alternative visions as to why history and memory matter in the current television landscape. Much current literature on nostalgia and television focuses on existing practices and niche programming for cable and internet audiences. Nostalgia networks like Nick at Night, TV Land, and MeTV have been discussed in terms of target demographics and the repackaging of old TV to camp, in order to provide what Lynn Spiegel calls fetish objects in the truest sense of the word, programs removed entirely from their larger historical contexts and meanings. Scholars like Derek Compare and William Boddy, among others, have long noted the industrial and cultural significance of straight syndication of old television shows on cable and national networks from the 1950s onward. This practice established early on a regime of repetition for television through which structures of memory, nostalgia, preservation, and history would begin to emerge. More recently, the easy availability of programs from years gone by on popular platforms like Hulu and Netflix will offer the occasion to ruminate on programming nostalgic TV as affecting a new kind of digital tourism, a way to personalize the experience of television history through binge and/or clip consumption. Touring television history in this way merges the interests of digital distributors and consumers keen to capitalize on the fervor for nostalgia at a time when the death of television appears imminent. Regional museums of television and broadcasting propose a different logic, linking nostalgia, history, and TV tourism. Many of them, like the Early Television Museum in Hilliard, Ohio, and the Pavic Museum of Broadcasting in Minnesota, operate as nonprofits. Most also situate this history through TV technology rather than programs, focusing on technical histories of television production and distribution, and TV sets as preservable, restorable, and memorable objects of study. And this is just one shot from the Early Television Museum, which is located also in Ohio. This is their post-war TV sets room. So keep this picture in mind for future pictures that will come up. Moreover, these museums strongly rely on local pathways of tourism to attract patrons. Larry Ahmed's museum lies in the heart of the most toured region in the state, an area bordering Amish country and known to attract tens of thousands of visitors during its annual Ohio Swiss Festival in September. Numerous niche galleries, wineries, conservation centers, historical sites, and other quirky attractions lure visitors to Ohio throughout the year. The Tuscarawas County Convention and Visitors Bureau digital portal, along with Cleveland and Ohio's tourism websites, and physical sightseeing offices typically located near highways or heavily traveled routes, offer comprehensive listings of these activities. Ahmed publicizes his museum through many, if not all, of these sites. Thus, it is strongly linked into the regional tourist market and associated with local economies of consumption. But Ahmed views his museum as operating on a broader scope of sorts than these examples and sites seem to allow. When I first stepped foot into the space proper, and Ahmed began his presentation on his museum, the first thing he revealed about it was its purpose. As he saw it, quote, "What the museum is doing is giving people a look at the sights and sounds of years gone by," end quote. Note that it's not a museum of television technology, despite the emphasis on TV sets, a regional history of TV, or even strictly a museum of television itself. Rather, Amen hopes to capture a sensibility or milieu for the immediate pre- and post-war eras, using television as the focal point for this study. Its narrative begins chronologically, with early experiments on technical formats and TV receivers during the time of radio's heyday in America. This picture that you see up here, a Jenkins set, displays the figure of Felix the cat, some of you might know is one of the first images ever broadcast by RCA in a 1928 experiment via W2XBS in New York. Next to it on the right, on your right, is the first Marconi tabletop receiver. Then on the other side sit Western and Baird sets. Each sports a placard listing the manufacturer, design model, and year, along with a brief description of the receiver and its initial retail price. Amen also places beside each TV set a framed print advertisement for that product, generally copied from a magazine or periodical of the time. Additionally, numerous technical journals, signs and books, tchotchkes, lamps, and photographs surround these consoles, sometimes resting in front or even on top of them. And this photo represents only a portion of the materials he has on display from this mechanical era of 1930s television experimentation. This is the part of the presentation where I sort of bombard you with some photos in the hopes of recreating just a small sense of what being in this museum space is like. So this is some more photos of the early television experimentation materials he has and stuff on early radio. And this is another one in that TV set on the right. The RCA Victor was at the 1939 World's Fair. So cool. About 1/4 of his museum is devoted to 1930s and early 1940s television experimentation. The rest features sets from the immediate post-war period, organized in chronological order by manufacturer, and this is also starting with the A's. Throughout the entire museum space, artifacts of all kinds litter the cabinets and shelves, from TV lamps and TV guides to clocks, record albums, and posters. While Amen may focus his dress most firmly on television technology, it's clear through these photographs that his museum requires a vast array of artifacts in order to fully engage with the sights and sounds of years gone by. As these pictures cannot fail to convey, he favors a very crowded museum display, thick and layered with multiple points of entry for the visitor. The TV receivers don't happen to catch your eye or spark a memory. Perhaps the photographs, or signs, or Mickey Mouse memorabilia you can see in the corner will. Board games and storybooks offer other productive ingressions. The particular programs may not register for younger patrons, but these formats and souvenirs tap into a more universal media experience spanning nearly all of television histories. Youngsters can and have found much to fawn over via such items. In one story, Amen tells me, he speaks of a group of 9 to 12-year-old schoolboys visiting the museum on a class field trip. They immediately gravitated towards a series of board games set up towards the back of the museum, one of which, Groucho's You Bet Your Life, was left open to display its game components and directions. Ordered by other games that, in the 1950s, were marketed towards a similar age and gender group as these school kids, Dragnet and Lone Ranger, which are in this picture, just to name 2 of them, the boys quickly found their access point to early television history. They were able to connect their media experiences and preferences to market cultures thriving long before they were born, in the process crafting personal and sociocultural paths and socioeconomic paths, linking past articulations with present media conditions. And the interactions between patrons and Amen himself also plays a really dynamic role in mapping television's past onto present media experiences. One of the museum's most popular items among all visitors is this collage of photographs on radio listening, circa 1930s and early 1940s. Though it sits rather innocuously in the museum space, resting amid the first set of board games and magazines on the floor that you see when you enter into the space, it's only textually situated via the headline, "Remember the early days of radio in 1930s and 40s, which is right up there. Amen speculates that visitors flock to this particular assembly because it exposes how people actually used early broadcast technologies within a museum setting plainly stuffed with them. For many of the older patrons, Amen observes, the appeal comes more from direct memory. They remember gathering around their radio or television sets with family and friends, and frequently swap stories with Amen and other visitors about their experiences watching, listening, and socializing in front of the broadcast receiver. It also results in offshoot discussions about the good old days of broadcasting, in contrast to current media environments of ubiquitous, yet frail or disposable technology. This reminiscence provides one of the first common outlets in the museum for patrons of all backgrounds grounds to begin charting the operative affective and cultural bounds they have with the displayed media objects. For younger patrons without direct memory experience of post-war television, the effect derives more from comparisons between how they engage with broadcast media today versus what behavioral patterns they observe in the photographs. Aumann's personal and historical narration of these and other images, artifacts, and television programs in the museum offers perhaps the most cogent point of entry for sustained identification of broadcast experiences then and now. As a TV repairman and collector for the past 50-plus years, Aumann has gathered an impressive wealth of knowledge on television from a variety of angles, including its broader industrial, economic, and cultural strains as a national medium of communication in America. The program loop he exhibits, for instance, provides a glimpse of title credits and advertisements for many popular post-war programs syndicated across the country. The Life of Riley, I Led 3 Lives, Kellogg's Super Circus, etc. And these are just a couple screen grabs that I took from that program loop. As visitors watch these clips, Aumann supplies a whole host of indiscriminate facts on them, from minute production and casting details, to network scheduling practices and sponsorship deals. But many of his recollections focus on personal experiences of watching television, alongside family and friends. He also shares several anecdotes on how these shows were regionally scheduled and how TV advertisers actively promoted their products through giveaways at local department or TV repair stores. And this is something that it's a Teddy Snowcrop puppet. Snowcrop was a brand that made the first frozen orange shoes. They advertised on Show of Shows, and this was a promotional item that Aumann got when he was a child at his local grocery store. Other displays in the museum likewise expose the regional caliber of the television experience Aumann establishes here. One display, towards the end of the museum, shows off the weather map and barometer gauges local weatherman Dick Goddard used during his reports on WKYC Channel 3 Cleveland during the 1950s. Aumann tells me that many patrons with established roots in the community instantly recognize the weather map and fondly recall Goddard's presence on their TV sets. Same is true of these enlarged photographs depicting scenes from the Gene Carroll Show, which was out of WEWS Cleveland. Thus, while Larry Aumann endeavors to frame his museum as a wide-ranging encounter with national, perhaps nearly universal strains of television history, localized and personalized accounts linked into these broader cultural narratives tell a much more complex and ultimately more engaging story of television's past. The intimate museum experience he narrates provides a model for how patrons should engage with museum materials and tie them into their own media backgrounds. The living history paradigm of television we see enacted here encourages visitors to tap into and craft nostalgia not as a simple glance backwards or a total pitch forward. Rather, collective and personal reminiscence works now to begin, foster, or complicate the processes by which people weave memory and history into their everyday encounters with media. In doing so, sites like the Aumann Museum of Radio and Television become more than outdated symbols of a televisual time long retreated into the symbolic time capsule of the local museum space. Rather, they can play an integral role in how we characterize television today. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to come up to the panel table. Mabel, Dale, thank you very much for sticking to the time. Want to sort of open it up to any kind of questions you guys might have about any of the presentations. We can go ahead and ask away, as it were. None?
Do you have access to much of this nostalgia yourselves?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Do you access much of this nostalgia yourselves?
Are you speaking to all of us, or?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure I totally understand your question. I'm sorry.
Right,
When you say do you access, what do you mean?
Access or seek access, was that the question?
I mean, do you like these sites? Does it make me feel nostalgic?
Is this material that you've been able to see and tinker with a little bit yourself?
Oh, is this more of a research question? Have I actually been able to look at these and sort of? Yeah, that's actually a really great question. I have, to a certain extent, not as much with these materials yet. Part of my larger project for my chapter 4 is looking at television collections that were done in the 50s and 60s and how, in the context in which they move now, right? So through museums, through libraries, in various commercial spaces, things like that. So there's one gentleman I'm in contact with who has just a really fabulous collection of early TV magazines, and I've been able to look through some of those. Some of these materials I've also used for reference, but have not sort of been able to really dig into because they're part of his museum space. He has about, I would say, 5 times more material than this, just in the attic above his house. I'm really hoping to get in there. We'll see how that goes, but I don't know if that answered your question.
Do you have available, after the presentation, collections of your slide presentations?
Mine is not, because, so my study was done through my school's IRB board, and I have sort of strict, I'm allowed to display them for presentations, but I can't just sort of hand them out to other people, so, yeah.
I have another version of the same question, which is more about your personal access to these things in the terms of your own nostalgia. I mean, what do these things mean to you? Other than as an object of study, because for me they're really important.
To me, you know, as you say, for more than just an object of study, to me they're access to a past that I never had in many ways. Even though I did grow up with television, it was something that was, for me, pretty regulated in my household, which of course made me want it all the more and made me seek it out all the more. And I can remember sort of watching FX back before it sort of had its own original program. It used to do blocks of Batman and the Green Hornet, and it was after my bedtime. I used to sort of sneak downstairs and watch it. I also just have a real affinity for, I'm a collector myself. I have a real affinity for anytime we have something that has largely been characterized as ephemeral, like television is, and we have these materials that somehow store something of it. To me, that's the sort of amazing part of television's past that hasn't really been looked at. That's what my larger dissertation project looks at. So for me, it's a sort of representation of television that I never experienced because I wasn't alive then, and a past that I never had access to sort of as a child that I want to kind of go back and look through.
It seems to me it sort of ties into your presentation last night about Route 66 and the different ways and the types of things, because for your memories, there would be sort of the direct experience, whereas for a different generation, it might be slightly different.
Right.
Yeah, and then it's even different from me watching it in rerun now, of course.
Oh, sure.
But others of you, what's your sense of engagement with this material? I mean, is it's really one of those weird questions about history that I was trying to follow yesterday. I mean, I'm not sure what history is, and I think that what it means to the historian.
Yeah, I mean, my interest is, my broad project is about public history in various forms and ways in which media memories are integrated into public history. And the thing that I think the most tangible way that I think about it is the way that I think about like vintage fashion, because I did love like vintage and retro clothing from the 50s and 60s especially. But what's important to me is not how, sort of like Kate, is not as evidence of the past, but as how they're integrated into the present, how they become, living objects. And so for me, that's sort of what museums are similarly, is museums aren't just about representing the past, they're very much about being integrated with the present and integrated with, other processes that are going on now and spaces that are going on that exist now.
I actually got into the discourses debate because I don't own a television, and everybody going back, I've been owning a television like 15 years, and everybody going back said, well, you got to get one. This is what it gives you. It gives you access to all these things. And I started to think that these discourses aren't new, right? There's something that when people didn't own televisions, they had to be convinced to buy one. And so I started to look at it that way. But as a historian, television is really unique because it's both a shaper of and a reflection of society and culture in ways that some other cultural means aren't, because it's so invasive. It's so in the home, everyone has access to it. And so that's what it does for me. It's just a unique tool to look back at American culture in an earlier period.
I'm wondering, for a day off, I'm wondering whether you have done any comparison with maybe the French discourses about television.
I haven't. That's in my future plans. I'm really just trying to keep this reasonable for a dissertation. I don't want to.
I'm just thinking that I'm wondering how unique the British-American dialogue is, and whether it wasn't broader than that.
Absolutely. I mean, part of the stuff that I didn't get to today was how influential the BBC was on the continent, and how you know, the French system, even the Australian system were very much modeled on the BBC in reaction to we don't want American television in our country. We want, if it's kind of the choice between two evils, right? You want, television's coming, but we might as well do it the BBC way because it seems to be a little bit more controlled. I haven't gotten into the discourses quite as much because, like I said, I'm just trying to finish the dissertation. But that is on my agenda in the future, so bring in a few more countries to really make this a true transnational project. That's a good suggestion.
Just as a suggestion, if you are looking for other countries, and you can do Finland, it's a fascinating case.
Yes, absolutely.
Because the academics were heavily involved in the shaping of the system early on, and it was also a partially advertiser-supported system from the 1950s.
Yeah, and actually, a couple of the totalitarian countries would be interesting to look at as well because, you know, television as a champion for democracy, television as a kind of tool for totalitarianism might be an interesting look at this as well.
And Germany, you know, I would be
Yeah.
curious, you know, after the war, you know, what happens then?
That's actually really interesting because America's pushing for sponsored programming in Germany from the very beginning. Get TV up and running, and the best way to do it is to establish a market and use commercials to make television a success. There were no commercials in West Germany until the 1980s, and so they were pushing back. Again, we don't want American television in our country. And you know, this kind of points to the fact that TV and Americanization are often coupled as to one, but we should be careful about that because television was very heavily influenced by the BBC around the world rather than American television. So,
Okay, I was curious, just in terms of your object of study, how did you find this particular museum?
That's actually that's a great question. I actually can't remember sort of exactly how which I found first. The slide that I had up there, that was from the early television museum. I believe was the one that the museum I found first, and I've been to that one, and they have it's set, TV set, TV set, TV set, and that's kind of all that they have. So I found this one to be a sort of really interesting juxtaposition, but I think that I believe I found it online. I was sort of curious about museums of broadcasting, did a bit of a search, and on page 12 of the Google search.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've done the same search of TV museums and they all come up. I mean,
Yeah.
they sometimes come up the more you look, the more you find.
Right.
Because there are these small museums all over the place, like a lot of networks, like the one in Minnesota, I think it's like to the local network there, and they
Yes.
just sort of put out their stuff. And it's always this question of whether they position themselves as a museum or not is
Right.
always an interesting thing. Because, people always have these artifacts displayed all over the place.
Right.
And yeah, so that's one of the things that these are a couple of the ones that are specifically.
Right.
And then if you just search like TV museum, they'll eventually come up.
And the Early Television Museum is supported by the Early Television Foundation, which has a sort of broader message of preservation, but they sort of support this museum that preserves TV sets as their sort of object. There's also another one called Media Heritage, which is, I believe, out of Cincinnati, and I know a little bit about that, and they are associated with the Voices of Broadcasting Museum, which is in Cincinnati, but they're currently constructing another museum space, which was supposed to open 2 years ago, and will open this spring, but you never know those things. So.
Any additional questions from anyone? I wanted to bring one other thing in, Mabel. I actually sat in Archie's chair.
When?
I was actually at the very last shooting of The Last All in the Family because my grandmother was very good friends with
In 79?
79.
Not the same chair, different chair.
Oh, okay.
They donated that chair in 1978 after that season ended, before they renewed it, before they decided to go on to do another season, which actually then was a big problem because those were just thrift store chairs that they just bought in LA at a thrift store. So they had to remake them, and they cost like $400 each to remake them for that one season.
It shapes my memories because it looked like the same chair anyways.
Yeah, it's still very cool.
One question?
Yes. How are any of you familiar with, or how deeply have you delved into the neurological and nostalgic foundations of television?
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes from a sort of much different perspective than we're coming at it. It's really
Mr. Rogers.
Mm.
And I don't actually know when that one was. Yeah, I mean, they have, like, right now, in addition to the chair setup, they also have a TV comedy setup. So they have some, they actually recently did a brief thing about Phyllis Diller, which I didn't get to see. But yeah, so right now, and they're usually somewhat thematic. So the TV comedy thing has, like, Fonzie's Jacket and has some Cheech and Chong records, which I think is interesting. But yeah, I don't know specifically if that was thematized in any way.
I guess that'll do it for the panel. Thank you guys for coming, and want to thank each of you for